Welcome, everybody. This is Carter Williams and Ellen Brown for Food is Health Revolution. Katie is in Paris or France?
At Chanel, of all, not just
Chanel.
in Paris, she is at Chanel in Paris.
And we have had a conversation the other day, Ellen and I, which was sort of like going down the rabbit hole. It was a pretty sort of technical, geeky conversation. And we have these conversations every now and then, and it seemed like we should record them more often because we're not quite sure where they go. As we continue to look forward to the next administration and some of the conversations that are going on, they're just a great deal of very interesting, rich conversations going around in the background. And so we're going to change our format here a little bit and share some of that craziness with the idea that while we couldn't figure out the answer to the craziness, that perhaps someone out there listening can, or perhaps can comment on our Substack. So with
just adding more context to what you're saying is, I think you and I and a number of others, but not a whole host of others, see this food is health conversation as much broader and more systemically dynamic than a lot of people think it is. So we see it as absolutely interconnected, starting with soil, going all the way to cell, right? You've said dirt to death.
Yes.
And
soil to death, or soil
to cell, or dirt to death. I don't know. It's Friday before the holiday. Maybe we'll stick with dirt to dirt. That's actually what you said. But then we kind of said, well, maybe it's death. I don't know. Anyways, we're getting morbid. I am. But I think what's really important is that there's a lot of fodder in food and in health and in food as medicine and, these terms about sick care and health care and, all this stuff. People seem to get pretty myopic in one piece where they say, well, this is broken or that is broken or we shouldn't have UPFs or we shouldn't have that. And then I feel like policy and our thinking gets myopic to that one concept.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you and I both really enjoy about having conversation with each other is that we push each other and allow each other the space to have this broader sort of, my partners make fun of me and say, can you just land the damn plane? And I think it's really important sometimes to just have circling conversations because your flight path becomes different sometimes and your target becomes different when you allow yourself to circle a bit, right?
Yeah.
So I throw that out there for people that this conversation to me is honestly where we unpack this conversation in the next month or two is really the core, it's a foundational element to how the future looks. Because I don't feel like anybody's, if we have, I hope we find them through this platform. I haven't met anybody who's taken the time to do what you're going to talk about from a systemic design perspective, to really think about how do you come up with a system that works, that people can be healthy. And like I asked you the other day, don't even necessarily need to think about being healthy like it used to be, right?
Well, and so we should dive into this a little bit, and with your prompting and the questions you were asking the other day, I will say that in my own mind, by day, we run a venture fund, and by night, I don't know what I do, but the world of venture capital right now is a little tough. Investments are off by 95% in the space of food is health. At the same time, we have Make America Healthy Again, basically saying we're ready to upend things. We've seen a little bit of tension going on even between Musk and RFK as, fewer drugs. Musk this week was saying, everybody should get GLP-1s. So there's a bed to that kind of tension. But I will say that one point of opportunity I had when you called the other day was I had listened to the New York Times Dealmaker Conference episodes it was a combination of interviews with Jeff Bezos, Sam Altman, Jay Powell, the CEO of Lilly. I'd recommend that people listen to it. I happened to also go back and listen to Musk's New York Times Dealmaker interview that he did a year ago, and even call me daddy. Who's that? I probably embarrassed myself not knowing this, but and I will say I was listening to these podcasts as I was driving up from Traverse City to Harbor Springs at 1:00 in the morning on an icy night, and about halfway through, I was driving about 60 miles an hour down a back road and hit some ice and did 20 and ended up in a ditch. But I still listened to the podcast, and I missed a couple parts.
Did you listen to the podcast while you were in the ditch?
We got out of the ditch, and I was so focused on concentrating on what I was learning online that my heart rate just sort of stayed steady throughout.
I have to digress for a second and say that makes me feel so much better, because I get a lot of grief from my family about my hyperfixation on these things. And to your point, I have a consulting firm by day where we're trying to create new care models and align new payment models and do basically economically a lot of the things that we're talking about, make them sustainable and bring them into the future, as opposed to, but we're also doing incremental stuff, right? And so like I don't know if the timing is the same, but 3:00, 4:00 in the morning, this systemic thinking is what comes about, and I get in trouble for hyperfixating on these things. So it makes me feel better that you would still listen to a podcast after seemingly being in death's door of despair. I would do the same thing, and it would actually make the whole experience better, because I feel like, okay, everything's fine. Still listening to the podcast.
It was sort of like spinning in a tornado. So let's dive in.
Okay, so you called me and we started talking theory, and started the conversation like a lot of times we typically do of all right, I just have a question for you. So let's go there where you started.
You want to start with that question? Do you remember what it was?
Well, you actually kind of called me and said I'm stuck on something, and it was right. You were stuck on something, which is something I'm stuck on, and I think you're going to tee it up differently. But the way I look at it from a layman's perspective is it's the systemic problem that no one's addressing.
Yeah. So when we look at what we have consistently looked at is that food is health. How do we essentially get to an environment where I can walk into a grocery store and it's hard to make a bad decision? I don't need an app. I don't need a whole bunch of people guiding me, that I sort of walk into the grocery store and it's hard to make a bad decision. And when you listen to folks like Elon Musk, or you listen to Jeff Bezos, and Jeff Bezos, had a vision for Amazon from the beginning. He executed on that vision over 25, 30 years. Elon Musk, in a similar way, does this. And even Sam Altman was another one of these interviews I listened to. And so I was sort of like, we have so much friction going on in terms of ultra-processed food is bad, healthcare is bad, it's this person's fault, it's that person's fault. How do we pull it together systemically? And so then I pull myself back and I think about what's going on with AI and large language models. We currently, in terms of our portfolio, have investments in the dirt in terms of improving carbon with a company named Earth Optics. We have another company that's doing Raman spectrometry, Meritera, that can look at both the microbiome in the soil and then the expression microbiome in the soil. What that basically does is it goes into the soil and pulls out the nutrients and get them into the plant. Then you get them into the plant, and we can use that same technology to look at the plant to understand its nutritional quality. The next step is we've got an investment in a company named Audacious, which can then evaluate the nutritional quality in meat or the nutritional quality in grains or anything of that sort, and provide you a feedback that basically says omega-3s or omega-6s are in balance or not. And then we've got two companies, Brightseed and Holobiome, which have built replica models of the human nutrition system and the human microbiome. And through that, they can sort of explore the science of those two factors to come up with new nutraceuticals that have pharmaceutical-like benefit, or can look at the microbiome, which has its own kind of benefit. And then we've just made an investment in a company named Alden Scientific. And Alden Scientific looks at the human proteomics along with your longitudinal data of your health data over time, and then starts to map those two things against each other. And when you really look at this whole framework, we really touch everything from the dirt, the carbon in the dirt, to the microbiome, to the migration through the plant, through the processing, what shows up at the grocery store, and then over time, what happens in your body as a result. When we think about what do we need to do next, if I go back to my days as an engineer at McDonnell Douglas and Boeing, when we had a crash, we circled around that crash and we figured out and looked back through all the history of that crash to figure out why that crash occurred. The analogy human would be...
Yes, exactly.
The analogy in a human would be every single time someone dies, that you go back and you say, why did they have they died of metabolic disease? Why did they die? Because they ate too much ultra-processed food. Why did they do that? And then stepping back, and it could be, in a sense, if we take the parallels of what we did in accident investigations on commercial aircraft or even military aircraft, we would go back 15 years into manufacturing, 20 years into manufacturing. Human, you could go back 20, 30, 40 years and really try to understand the root cause of what was going on, which then, and I'll pause in a second, leads me to sort of there's a whole framework for how we did that, of root cause analysis. It was massive understanding of how you build an aircraft, how humans operate, the environment around it, which is audacious and Meritera, the data, and then integrate it in a way that in design tools you can sort of look through these things and figure out how to redesign the system so that you eliminate the error in a sort of a lean Six Sigma kind of way. The real philosophy there is look at the data and figure out how you re-engineer the system so that it operates correctly.
I do want to say, because and I called you yesterday, I call you sometimes with the most parochial questions, and you luckily humor me and don't make me feel a fool. But, I called you yesterday and I said, call it World War II, right? Like I'm going to call it recent history, right? Did people actually know how to be healthy? Was it a thing, right? Because it's like this whole thing now, right? Like I have to learn how to be healthy. Like anytime you ask people, well, how do I fix healthcare? Or how do I make people, make America healthy again? Well, we have to educate people. It goes back to your point about the grocery store. It was like, I kind of had this epiphany, like, you didn't have to worry before because life was sort of set up healthy, right? We didn't sit in front of desks. We didn't live a sedentary life. We didn't eat ultra processed food. We didn't, right? Like 100 years ago, we weren't sitting around saying, I think you probably would talk about maybe not having as many sweets. Like if you were not fitting into your clothes, I'm sure that was a conversation, but it wasn't, are you wearing a CGM? Are you monitoring glucose? So what's happened though, is that we created this healthcare system economically, I'm going to call it, right? The economic model of healthcare, so that's what drives it all, was built on keeping people alive because that's what healthcare was. You only access the healthcare system, we talked about this, when you were sick, like to keep you alive, or you had a baby or something, you broke a bone. And so then we've evolved that whole system. And so there is no economic incentive right now to say, let's evaluate why people are dying other than I want to keep people alive because people don't want to die. Just totally different than, gosh, a lot of people are dying. It's costing our country a lot of money. It's leading up to the death, right? There's a ton of chronic care costs. And it's like, that's part of this issue is that nobody has an economic incentive to unpack exactly what we're talking about. When people die in a crash, we care, right? And I think maybe because we're getting to such a tipping point of so many people dying prematurely with such a cost burden around what now we're realizing is avoidable or reversible disease, perhaps that's why, right? But we need to do that. We need to evaluate the crash. Like, why have we crashed and burned metabolically and health-wise?
Yeah, so a thing we say is when people, we have discussed for some time the concept of food as health. And a characterization I've put out there is that we have three food systems. System A is Adam and Eve. Garden of Eden, you had fresh vegetables, apples. You have all these different things that notionally are good, but practically it's not incredibly scalable. If you have people living in Norway, they're not going to get apples. The world is sort of expanded, and it's hard. For whatever reason, we don't have a Garden of Eden. But System A is healthy, nutritious, not very scalable. As we got to World War II, we recognized that famine was used to exert political will, and you could undermine an army very quickly with famine. And what we said was, and we've done that for years in terms of military combat, what we said at the end of World War II is, let's fix that. We, the United States, said, let's fix that. Let's go and eliminate famine. And some of you may recall that as sort of UNICEF as a child, but it was a global effort to increase output. And through a combination of efforts from 1945 until 2010, we did a whole bunch of different work in genetics and production, a whole bunch of different things. And we went from 20 bushel corn per acre to 320 bushel corn per acre, and just dramatically changed it. And by 2010, got to the point that we had calorie parity across the world. But now, instead of people dying to 35, they live into 60, and they're picking up diabetes either because now they're living to 60 and or they're eating too much sugar. And so, and then on top of that, and so that's system B. System C is something that we say, well, okay, you have system A, which is tasty, nutritious, and great.
But not scalable.
Not scalable. You have system B, which is cheap and scalable, but not nutritious. And so the engineer in me says, or the systems person in me says, well, let's develop system C and have system C be as nutritious as A and as cheap as B. And so people say, you can't do that. That's not possible.
And
well, it is possible. It is possible if you take a systems view and re-engineer it. And the best example I have of that is Fairlife. So Fairlife Milk was an effort in which they looked through the vertical supply chain and they repositioned the product. Whether the product is more or less expensive is not exactly the case here, because consumers, no matter who they are, look at that product and say, net of the quality of the product, net of where it presents on the storefront, where it presents in my health equation, I'm going to buy that thing because I like it for its taste, I like it for the children's health, and the consumer is integrating both the sticker price plus the health cost into a conversation and making a decision. And in a sense, I consider that affordable in that grand context of things. And affordable if you include the healthcare cost. And so
yes,
the
thank you.
60,000 SKUs in a Walmart grocery store, in a sense, you could do that same thing from a systems view to everything in that grocery store, whether it's the milk next to Fairlife or the broccolini or maybe even the Cheetos have an opportunity. Cheetos might have an opportunity here to be healthy.
Well, or I'm just making a case for Cheetos. We actually bring behavioral health, mental health into the equation, and we look at the food relationship. So as part of the systemic design, right, this conversation, this unpacking, you look at, we've talked about this, there's a whole element of food is actually to keep you alive. We've turned it into an emotional thing. And so if you truly go back to health and say, well, there's a certain amount of happiness, or I don't know, whatever term, happiness is a horrible term, but it's like the good part of life, the dopamine kind of stuff, you still need a certain amount of that. And so maybe there's a case to be made for Cheetos as more of that, sort of like happy dopamine thing.
Yeah, I mean, I just did Function Health, which is for people's benefit. Mm-hmm. Function Health is what Mark Hyman's done. He's got a company. He said, look, here are 200 blood tests that make sense for someone to take. And he worked with Quest to say, we'll do these 200 blood tests. If you did them individually, they'd cost $3,500. We'll make them available for $700 and go run your tests. And so yep. I'm a 58-year-old male, probably not in great shape. And so off I go and take these tests. And, out of, not all of them are in yet, but I think out of 160 that have come in, I've got concerns on 7 of the variables, which really sort of relate to genetic related disorders around cholesterol for the most part. I mean, it wasn't like, oh, you're eating too much processed food. It's just that you're genetically predisposed to processed cholesterol in this particular way. And so I look at that and I like, man, evolution has worked this out. I mean, like, without thinking about it, here's a 58-year-old system that's been operating with variable inputs. I haven't had any Cheetos in a while, but variable inputs. And evolution has sort of worked this thing out so that it's in balance. It hasn't failed. The engines haven't fallen off. I'll probably drop dead of a heart attack next week.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. But that's the thing, Carter, is what does that standard of diagnostic look like, right? Which goes to your point about, like, I would say to you, okay, but should you, like, there's I know the CMO, the company Pronuvo, that you do, or Pronovo, that you do the full body scans. Like, should you be doing a full body scan to see on the inside, like not just the blood, but is there plaque, right? Like, I mean, I have a friend who is seemingly healthy, but wasn't seemingly healthy before, right? He has what is it?
I had a CAD score on it as
okay. Well. All right. So you're okay, fine. So but you get what I'm saying? Like, there also is this whole piece. So I guess where I'm going, my head starts to spin forward and say, you take your case study, right? But you say, what should that diagnostic standard look like for somebody who wants to sort of own and manage their health, as opposed to somebody who wants to only do that when they're sick?
Yeah,
right?
So let's go.
The system C.
System. Well, let's take this back up the system conversation.
Right.
And as we collectively within the food is health movement, as we think about how to treat care, one key element is around the idea of N of one, which is what's right for you, what's right for me. I mean, my test came out right. There are other people whose tests didn't come out right. So let's be empathetic for that challenge. But what's right for each one of us is a variable. Evolution has worked for 350,000 years to make humans, and maybe even longer if you take our ancestors, to make humans operate around a particular model and operate in a way that science hasn't fully discovered yet. I mean, we're still unraveling what evolution has figured out. We then got into 1890 and started inserting a lot of sugar, and all the rich people got diabetes because they could buy sugar, and then sugar got cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and then everybody was able to get diabetes, and then we scaled it, and then we had this upset to the system in a very short period of time, 100 years out of 350,000 years, and our bodies haven't adapted. So now, if we think, what are we going to do next? Food is health. Is food is health going to solve all the problems? I think that from a systems viewpoint, what I would say is, let's get the nominal right so that you can walk in a grocery store and it's hard to make a bad decision. And then the individual, in terms of what works for them, you sort of want to remove the friction. Depending on who they are, it might be that they should be on a GLP-1 because that works better for them. It might work that they join CrossFit and they do keto and it works for them. There's another pile of things down that path, but I think it's our responsibility to take a systems view and make a change. And the point of where I was last weekend was, after listening to Sam Altman sort of say, I'm going to spend $8 billion to ingest all this data to be able to train an LLM. I'm like, if I were back designing a commercial aircraft or a military aircraft, we had a very systems view to how to do that so that when the door falls off, the plane still flies. It doesn't die. When you look at evolution, 350,000 years produces a 58-year-old who's green on most of their tests, despite the fact that they haven't like checked in or done anything to manage the system particularly well. So at a system level, how do we fix this? And I'm in a mindset that we probably should spend $1 billion or $2 billion training an LLM on food is health. I mean, that, in the grand scheme of things, to get a little closer to what evolution's already figured out, we should do that. And then the other thing I'm sort of at is Fairlife is a good example of something that's done well. Base state milling.
Yes.
Has spent a bunch of time building genetics for better wheat. And they now have a wheat that has a high fiber, high protein, high taste profile to it. And they can produce pasta from that wheat that delivers 15 grams per serving of fiber, protein, and taste. It's not cardboard. And that at a price point that drops right into SNAP. Now, if you look at the SNAP profile of a kid on SNAP, they're not getting 15 grams of fiber.
Nope.
And so that's an example where what Bay State did is they're a miller, but they went backwards and they went to Australia over several years and bred that wheat, and then worked with farmers to figure out how to grow it, and then figured out how to produce it, and then how to optimize it and deliver it at a price point. So Bay Street did what was necessary for vertical integration, in a sense of optimizing growing practices, processing ingredients, into a final product. And so when we're thinking of a systems view of what's going to go on in food as health, it's going to take an effort, not have ADM do its own thing or Cargill do its own thing or Nestle. But what's going to require is we need innovations that make it easier for people like Nestle and Unilever to work with ADM in a fashion that generates the same type of value for consumers that Fairlife has pulled off or Bay Street Milling has pulled off. And to do that for 60,000 SKUs Walmart Supercenter, or maybe it's going to be 20,000 SKUs, but it's going to be more than one, and then present that in the grocery store in a fashion that people have access to it. And the easiest way to change behavior is price. And so if that price of those new products is not dramatically different than the bad products, people will make that decision and move that direction, and then the system will make the shift.
I mean, perfect example, not perfect example, but another example of that on the healthcare side, a pain point on the healthcare side that's going to end up presenting an opportunity on the food side, okay, is a ton of, you're going to see in the next, I don't even think it's going to take a year, next 6 months, unless there is federal pressure, which I can't see that there can be, is health plans are just, they're nixing GLP-1 coverage left and right. Because it's $1,500 a month. It's not affordable for them. There's not an ROI, right? Like you and I have talked about, there's a big shift. You take $1,500 a month and give it to the pharmaceuticals and take it out of the acute care hospital, right? But there's not a savings for the health, and not in today's current economic model. And so what you're going to see though, in the next 12 months is you're going to have all these people that either were on GLP-1s, now it's not covered, or they want GLP-1s and they can't get coverage. And that bucket of people that don't have the disposable income to just pay for it themselves, they're going to look for an alternative. And if we were able to present a food alternative, right, like El Nutra, like Prolon, right, or something, or Aaron's Fresh RX, where it's like here's a nutritionally dense addictive, like we've talked about this, right? Nutritionally dense, regeneratively grown produce arguably has similar addictive qualities to a UPF. So if you make, to your point, reduce the friction, like people are going to be seeking these alternatives when the pharmaceutical version isn't available, right? And we need to pull up, like with what you're talking about. I feel like we need to pull all the way up, which is what you and I talked about last weekend, is start at the metabolically unwell person, which is 3 trillion of our 5 trillion, if not more. So now it's more like 3.5. The heck is happening? Right? We got to unpack that and work backwards and then redesign the inputs that are causing that, as opposed to just redesigning little pieces of it, right? We got to step all the way up systemically.
So can I fully geek out here for a second? I'm just going to go into a territory that's probably people are like,
I love it.
What the hell is he talking about?
Yeah, so if any of you are ready to walk away, now is the time to walk away.
So we do this in aircraft. So you want to build aircraft that still fly if the door flies off. And that's actually a process. You don't just we lucked out this time. That's thought about. 40 years ago when you're designing a 737 or 1968, you're designing 737, they're like, well, the door could fall off, or this could happen, or the lever could fail, or all those things are considered and evaluated, just like all the different ways in which you can die. And then you build things and they don't work out, and then you got to figure out how to resolve them. Well, so we have a supply chain that basically has said the most efficient way to produce things is to have the processor separate from the farmer processor, separate from the ingredients company, separate from the CPG that's building food. We've decided separate all those out. We decided that, not unlike when we decided how to build a car. We're going to have a car. The steering wheel's going to be on the left. There are going to be 2 wheels. There's going to be an engine in the front. It's going to run on gasoline. I mean, at the time, before Ford came along, there were 1,000 car companies, and they were doing electric and ethanol, and they were doing all different kinds of. And finally, they just sort of, just make it look like the Model T. And then, boom, they figured out the Model T, and Ford came along, and what did he do? He didn't invent the car. He drove the price down. So we have a food system, System B, that's designed around this environment, and now we're talking about a System C. So
System C.
We redesigned. We had System B, and then we are trying to design System C, which means maybe the processor is going to be integrated with the ingredients company. There's a different way in which these things are going to be integrated. And there is an actual methodology when you have these kinds of shifts where the industry has been very horizontally integrated, now vertically integrated, where the integration between the different components, like I need to optimize, I'm not optimizing food for yield any longer, I'm optimizing food for nutrition. So there are different variables that that's like I'm trying to build a laptop that's faster and faster and faster. No, I'm trying to build a computer that's faster and faster and faster. Now I need to build a computer that's more portable and power efficient. So there are these shifts that go on that require you to balance, different kinds of things in the design and require different kinds of people. I mean, in this case, I needed a engineer who was really good at making fast transistors, and in this case I need one that's really good at making a power efficient transistor. So and there's an approach, and this is where it's going to get geeky, there's this thing called design structured matrices, for example, and what you do is you basically map out every single step all the way through, all the way to completion of the thing that you're trying to do, and then you look at that, and when it fails, a good example of this was Intel for years had been saying we need to build software to do thermal management analysis of our chips early on, and nobody would fund it. It was $3 million. Nobody would fund it in the company. And then all of a sudden in the mid 80s, they came out with a new chip that failed on the thermal and put a 6-month delay in release of the chip and cost Intel like $500 million. And they're like, I wish we had spent that $3 million. And they looked at that, and essentially there is a process when you're using things like design structured matrices to basically say, here's the whole map. Oh, look, a person died over here. Why did they die? Let's do the feedback system. Look back at boom, 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 all the steps in the system for why that maybe happened. And then you look and you say, you know what? It failed because we did this ultra processed food thing. We're really trying to maximize for addiction. We weren't trying to maximize for health. Now, if we can start maximizing for health, we need a different set of people. We need audacious in here to look at the variability of the inputs so that we reduce the variability of the inputs, because if we reduce the variabilities and increase the nutritional density of the inputs, we can then have an affordable input that goes into this thing. And because of the nature of that having more nutritional quality, it's got a better taste profile that's a more natural taste profile, not amplified by sugar. And now we can sort of engineer that to a point where we can build a food like Bay State, in which you say that it's got more fiber, more nutrition, and more taste, and is effective. And so it is an intense engineering process as applied to something like commercial aircraft, or an intense engineering process as it is applied to chip manufacturing. It's going to be similarly intense here to build an affordable food system. But that's what you're going to do, and really it's not, in the grand scheme of things, it's not that hard. It's something that can be done. But what you need to do is you really need to build your teams and your startups and the supply chain along that vertical supply chain, because how you interact is going to change. It can't just be Nestle saying, you know what, ship some corn at the end of the dock and we're going to take it and go process it inside. It's going to be, hey, Nestle, go out to these sets of farmers, make sure they use these regenerative practices to get these crop attributes, because we're less worried about yield, we're worried about these crop attributes. And the final point here is it won't cost more. The cost comes in from the waste associated with not having these requirements in balance. Once you get the requirements in balance, you will likely find that the cost is pretty much the same. Its value might be higher because there's a component in the value proposition related to health. And so it will work itself out. You're not making a huge cost trade when you take a systems view to it. And with that, I have to say I have to be on an investment committee meeting in 2 minutes. But
no, that's it, man. You captured it. So, I mean, part two, look, I think in February we need to reserve a room with wall-to-wall white everything and
go through this.
Yeah, we gotta start. This has to be done. We're gonna take, Carter, saying it now, we're taking 50% out of the $3.5 trillion in 10 years.
It'll happen. If you do the systems view, I found out that you think it's gonna take you 15 years, and actually once you start getting going, it takes
all at once. There it is, all at once. Okay.
All I want
Happy
to say,
holidays.
a good entrepreneur does more than expected for less than expected. Yes. Have a good holidays.
All right. Bye.
Bye.